Well, class, welcome to our continuing series here. We're into biblical leadership, and we're looking at lesson 3, which is the leadership of King David. Checking our lesson outline, we can see that we're right now in lesson 3, just getting started a little bit. Last week we looked at the leadership of Moses, and in lesson 1 we get a definite, well, we just took a first look at what it looked like to be a biblical leader, checking some of the definitions, what it looked like to be a biblical leader, and just as importantly, what a biblical leader isn't. Doing a bit of review here, we're just going to look at 2 defining characteristics of God-led leaders. First of all is God-led leaders obey the will of God. They're going to follow God's will, not their own agenda. An example of this is Saul versus David. Saul eventually ended up working on his own agenda, letting it go to his head a little bit that he was king, where David, for the most part, was always following God's will. And that, of course, is tied into a reliance on God, that you have to rely on God's power and his provision, not your own talents and your own resources. This actually can be easier for somebody that maybe isn't quite as maybe charismatic as a leader, or maybe doesn't have quite some of the skills, because then they know they have to depend on God. If somebody's getting into a leadership role and they're really, they actually have the skills to do it somewhat on their own, they have to watch out that they don't really think that it's them that's getting some of these great results, that it's really God's power and his provision that are doing it, because if you're following God's will. And eventually, if they keep thinking it's their own, they're going to find out that no, it's not, and they'll crash. We've seen too many of those happen as we looked at some of the leaders of the church over the years. Looking again at this little chart that I came up with, let's kind of take a look at this one, what God does in the development of leaders and the characteristics needed by the leaders in that particular phase, and look at this in regard to David's kingship and his leadership stations as he was moving up and along. First of all, of course, God is the one who selects his leaders, which means you have to be available. David was available. There's a difference between being available and seeking. We've talked about this before. Somebody that's really saying, pushing that they want to be a leader, probably is not the best one to be the leader, and probably is not one that God's going to pick, because they're doing it, just about have to figure out they're in it for their own glorification. They're looking for the title, they're looking for the prestige, they're looking for the power. Whereas somebody that's maybe not so much looking for it, but is just saying, okay, God, whatever your will is, if you want me to do this, that's what I'll do. I'm available. Use me. It's been said that that's the most dangerous prayer you can ever pray is, Lord, use me. Because he's going to. If you really say it and you really mean it, he will. And he'll probably use you in ways you won't even imagine. Some of you can probably already testify to that when you think, wow, I didn't think I was ever going to be doing this that I'm doing now out here, giving in these motels, giving messages of hope to these people. Okay, we look, God trains and equips his leaders. That means you have to be teachable. Well, David was trained as a shepherd. He was trained again when Saul brought him into his court. He was trained in the wilderness. And then he was continuously trained as he actually took the reins of the nation. God will deploy the leader, which means the leader has to be ready to listen and follow what God's telling him. And this often happens in stages. We see David was deployed versus Goliath. The rest of the army was out there just kind of quivering in their boots whenever Goliath would come out there and bellow and say, come on, somebody come out and face me. And here this little shepherd boy basically comes out and says, okay, I'll do it because God says that I can do it. So he was listened and he followed at that point. He was a leader in the army. When he was under Saul, he was out there leading. He also was leading when he was out there with the people in the wilderness after Saul was trying to kill him. He learned, again, a different way of leadership by being deployed out into the wilderness and leading this kind of ragtag bunch. Then we see that God guides his leaders. And the leader has to be humble and have all the other capabilities of being available, teachable, you being able to listen and follow, because it goes in cycles. We just look at this. We just talked about this. God deployed him against Goliath. Then he made him a leader of the army. Then he sent him out as this leader of this kind of ragtag bunch. Then he made him king. And then as he made him king, he had him doing all these other things. So this thing just keeps going in a cycle. And as more and more you follow and do exactly what God's will is, you'll find out that you'll be deployed in bigger and better things. I'm going to take a quick look at a comparison between Moses and David. We looked at Moses last week, so we'll take a look at the comparison. Okay, first of all, that there was no doubt of each one's selection to lead. Moses was informed of the selection directly by God at the burning bush. David was informed by the prophet Samuel of his selection to be king. So they had absolutely no doubt that they were selected. Both Moses and David were military leaders. Now, sometimes we don't really look at Moses so much as a military leader, but there were a lot of campaigns that they had to go and fight out there when they were wandering around and circling around the desert. And he actually was a pretty darn good military leader. I've actually seen some things where they were, military leaders of today were studying some of his strategies even. And the same thing, of course, we know David, was a military leader. So they both had that in common. Now Moses served the leader under the theocracy when God was the king. There was no doubt about it. God was present with them in the pillar of fire and the cloud that led them as they were out there wandering around for those many years. And David served as a king under the monarchy when God allowed Israel to have human kings. And we talked about that. The people finally decided they wanted a human king like the nations around him, and God basically said, okay, but he also gave him a warning. You have to remember that. But the other thing, of course, is that David remembered is that, God's still the ultimate authority. Now we look at a comparison between Saul and David. Again, we look at, both of them were anointed by God to be king. Saul looked like a king. You remember the description when they first talked about Samuel appointing him. He was tall, like a head, full head above all the rest, kind of the tall, dark, and handsome type. He just looked the part. David, on the other hand, they described him as kind of small, ruddy complexion, looked like a shepherd. Now, Saul, unfortunately, let the power go to his head. He got really enamored with the title of king, held on to it a bit too tightly. David knew that the power belonged to God. Saul really held on tightly to the power, but David held it loosely, knowing that God has the final say who's going to lead. David realized that, it's God that picks these leaders, and if you are not doing what he wants, he's going to take it away, because he had just seen that happen to Saul. We start looking at some of the criteria that we can see in the kingship of David and the leadership that he does, of how God, first of all, look at how God selects these leaders based on his criteria. When Samuel was sent off to anoint David, we see here in 1 Samuel 16, verse 7, it says, "Do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, for God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." David really didn't look like the human concept of a king, like Saul did, or even like David's older brothers. If you remember back in this passage when Samuel first showed up, he was going, "Oh, wow!" Like the older brother really looked pretty much like he thought maybe a king should look like. But as he kept going, and God just kept saying, "No, not that one, not that one, not that one, not that one." It's like, okay, well, you got anything left? And then Jesse goes out and says, "Well, I got this one other son that's out taking care of the sheep, but can't be him. You know, he doesn't look like a king. Brings him in, and Samuel says, that's the one. But David's heart and character were what God saw as kingly attributes, not his physical attributes. Becoming more like God and shaped, to God's heart and his character. That was what David had going for him. He definitely, struggled at times, but he wanted so much to be pleasing God, doing what God told him to do. That's why he was called a man after God's own heart. So the first principle we see is that leaders learn that God's selection of his leaders is not based on superficial qualities or even the skills, but based on their godly character and their heart. As Pastor Rick says, God's much more interested in your character than he is in your comfort. He's also much more interested in your character than the way you look or any other skills you might have. Okay, another thing we look at is, the biblical leaders follow God's leadership. David developed character by following God's directions as a shepherd, and most of the time, throughout his time as a king. We look at this shepherd thing here, and it's used quite a bit, especially when we talk about Jesus as being, the shepherd, the ultimate shepherd, the good shepherd. And we have to look at that too as we're leaders, especially when we're in like a pastoral type role. And the thing we just have to remember is that we're always the under shepherd to the great shepherd. And that's something David recognized. He followed God's directions. He followed him when he was facing, the beasts, when he was out taking care of the sheep. Bears and lions. That's not something that you're normally going to want to go up against, but God was teaching him as he was doing that, and he followed, and he was successful. Facing Goliath. That's not obvious for a relatively small, ruddy-looking shepherd to go up against this battle-hardened giant of a man. And when he was facing the Philistine nation, at that time, the Philistines were the military power in the area. And yet David was willing to follow God's leadership to go and take care of that in the way that God told him. And even when David failed, he would then seek forgiveness, he'd seek correction and redirection and get back into the path that God wanted him to be on. And David gave the credit to God as the source of his courage and ability. He knew that God was worthy of his trust and that he would deliver what was needed. Every now and then, there were a few times where David needed reminded of this, but most of the time he was really right there on it with that. So the second principle we see is that leaders learn to follow God with courage and faith in the face of obstacles, because the Lord is our trustworthy deliverer. And then we see biblical leaders follow God faithfully. David didn't turn on God's anointed king. It was Saul at the time. Even though Saul wanted to kill David, he was relying on God for justice. If you read the scriptures, recall, David had a couple opportunities where it would have been real easy for him to kill Saul and then take over as king. But he said no. Saul was God's anointed. It's up to God to take him out. I know Saul's trying to kill me, but I know that God will vindicate me and he'll deliver what he's promised. Because David knew that God was faithful to his promise and that he would be king. So David himself was faithful to follow God's plan to accomplish it. He wasn't going to take any shortcuts that might be presented. He was going to do it the way God wanted it done, keeping his character intact, as we had just talked about, being a man of character. And David followed God's directions even when they seemed impossible. Obviously, going up against Goliath, it was a pretty impossible looking task for normal people. The whole army of Israel wasn't really up to doing it. None of the great warriors supposedly there wanted anything to do with Goliath. But David was confident because he knew God was with him. He was confident in battle. He followed the directions. The odds most of the time were against him. Most of the opposing armies were bigger. But God was with David and with the army of Israel. And so he only attacked when God said to, and he followed God's battle plan. I recall some other instances, like when they were out just as right after they crossed the river and they had done their little march around there, and they won that one, and they said, okay, now let's go over to the city of Ai. And they weren't supposed to, and they went over there anyway, even though they weren't supposed to, and they got soundly defeated. So principle 3 is we see that leaders learn to follow God's commandment and principles faithfully. Do what God says, do it the way he says, and things will work out. Now we're going to look at a couple God-dependent aspects of biblical leadership. Biblical leader has patience, willingness to be led by God, and humility. Sometimes you just got to have patience to let God's plan work. A lot of times we have our own idea of how things should work, the timeline it should be on, and God has something completely different. And that's when he expects us to have the patience in order to let his plan work out. Because we often don't see what's going on behind the scenes. He's working things here and there that we don't really see. One thing you might not want to do is pray for patience. Because then he's going to put you at the DMV or something like that. And it's going to make you really test your patience. You got to have humility to know that God is the one in charge and not try to take it on your own, especially when you're seeing that this plan's not working the way you thought it would or in the time you thought it would. To say, okay, I don't really know better than God, so I'm going to sit here and let it follow his plan. Not going to think I know better than go do it my way. Which means you have to have a willingness to do it God's way. A God-dependent leader shows obedience to God, and that obedience brings blessings. We've seen that throughout the history that we've looked at so far. All through the time of the lead up to the prophets and all that, we saw this whole cycle. Even the judges, as Israel would do things the way they're supposed to do, they'd be obedient, things would be going good, then they'd fall away, things would get bad, they'd ask for help, they'd get somebody to restore them, and things would go good. But when they weren't obeying, we discovered that disobedience to God brings curses. And eventually it got so bad that they were kicked out of the nation and taken off into hostage into Babylon. That's a case where God had a lot of patience before he finally said, okay, I've been trying like crazy to get you guys to do things my way. Obviously, I've just got to do something to get your attention. Now, another aspect is David recognized that it's God's kingdom, not his. God's the one who chooses who's going to lead. God chooses how they're going to lead and how to defend the kingdom. It all belongs to God. Whatever, whether it's King David or whether, it's us being in some leadership role, we're a leader by God's choice and by his choice only. We have to follow God's plan when we're doing that. And we just have to remember that God is going to vindicate against the detractors. And anytime you get into a leadership role, there's going to be detractors. Somebody's going to be jealous that you're leading. Somebody's going to think they're better. There's always going to be somebody that's going to find something wrong with the way you're doing it. So we really just need to be willing to let God vindicate us and keep on doing it the way that he says we're doing it. But, we find it's awful hard not to take this personal, when somebody starts questioning our leadership. And we remember back, when the people said they wanted an earthly king and Samuel was taking it personally. And God had to remind him, says, no, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. And that's really hard to do, is to not take it personal, especially when you sometimes really want to, please God, and you get all this and you go, well, maybe they're right sometimes. I don't know. But you just have to let God vindicate it. Most of the time you're not going to be able to argue them out of it anyway. Their mind's made up, and they're not going to change their mind. So you just have to keep going and knowing that as long as you're doing what's God's will, really what they say doesn't matter. Now, A little bit later, we're going to talk that there are some times when we might need to listen to what other people are saying. But now, how to be a God-dependent leader? It's only in your relationship with God where you develop the requirements to be a God-appointed leader. Some of the steps, and this is right out of your text for this class. So, number 1, seeking His will through prayers and petitions, but not His power. If you go and ask for the power, you're probably not looking at it right. If we look at this, all the great leaders, they've been asking God for guidance and how to do what God wants to do. If you're doing what God wants you to do, the power is going to be there. If you're praying for power, it might be something to watch out for, that you're maybe going about this wrong and you're letting it go to your head a little bit, and you're getting a little bit of an ego trip there and a little bit power mad or whatever, and just as something to keep an eye out for. Now, if you're like playing for a different kind of power where you're just saying, Lord, I'm just completely and totally drained. I need to plug into your power supply to keep me going. That's one thing. But don't play, for the power, to be a, dominating person or whatever. That's what we're trying to avoid. You have to wait and listen, for His guidance and His instructions. That's why it says, be still and know that God is God. You just have to be there and listen. And that's one of the hardest things to do, is sit and wait and listen for Him and His guidance. Especially, a lot of the type A types out there that's like, got to do it now, got to do it, something's got to happen now. Makes it really hard for them to sit back and just wait and listen. Now, it doesn't mean you don't, you don't take it to the extreme and just say, well, I'm going to sit here and I'm not going to budge or do anything until I hear, from a loud, clap of thunder and a booming voice from the sky that this is what you're supposed to do. No, it is, remember, the still small voice. Okay, and once He gives you His will, you got to remember to obey it and His instructions, rather than our own ideas. God knows best. And you got to be submitting and willing, to lose everything because it's not ours in the first place. And because God's eternal reward is just completely and totally without comparison. We look at this, the prophets, a lot of them gave up everything. Look at Ruth and Esther. They were willing to give up everything. The good kings that we looked at, during the reign of the kings in Israel. And of course, Jesus. He set aside being at the right hand of God to come down and become one of us in order to save us, so that we could enjoy that eternal reward that we're talking about. And that, of course, we're going to look at in a couple of weeks, which will be, Jesus as a leader who is the ultimate leader. There's some worship aspects of biblical leadership too. A lot of times, David was Israel's worship leader in addition to being their king. He wrote most of the Psalms. He played the harp, several other instruments it sounded like. He was known to dance occasionally. Got a little bit in trouble with one of his wives for that, but through his songs, which are the Psalms, his poetry, he basically led Israel back to true worship of God. And of course, this was all done in conjunction, with the priests and the prophets. And you look at the contrast, to the surrounding nations. The other nations, most of the time, worshipped, their king as one of their multiple array of gods. But David showed how God's earthly king worships the true king. So David was a worship leader. Wow. He also performed some priestly roles. As I was preparing for this, it just hit me as like, okay, why was it okay for David to do some of these priestly roles when Saul got in trouble for it? Was it that David's attitude was different, or the people recognized David's devotion to God? I don't really know, but that's a something to ponder on that maybe we can discuss sometime if we get a little bit of time, just to think about, why that difference was there. And any biblical leader, no matter what position you're in, should model how to worship God to those whom he or she leads. Sometimes it's just the way to do it. It's not necessarily your own thing. I mean, you might be pastor of a big church, but you can participate in the worship, and that's going to help others maybe follow. If biblical leaders might take on several tasks other than the main focus of his or her leadership in order to properly care for those people, for the people that are being led. Just by singing along during congregational worship. That might, act as an example to the people that know that you're a leader. You say, okay, he's the leader in this, role over here, but here he is. He's worshiping along with us. We should be doing this too. He encourages people to partake. A lot of people are sometimes a little nervous, or maybe they don't have the voice that they think they should have to be able to sing along to God, and that's when I'm quite thankful for the fact that it does say make a joyful noise. And so if they look up and they say, hey, that's my motel minister leader, or that's my small group leader, or whatever, it's up there, it's like, well, they're singing, so can I. Why not? Because they're comfortable with you, maybe, and that'll get them doing it. So there's a lot of times you might be doing something other than your main task, but it's a way of still caring for the people that God has put you in charge of. Because remember, you may be the one that is shepherding, but you're still the under shepherd to the great shepherd. So what are some of the conclusions that we can draw out of this? Well, first of all, both David and Moses had no doubt about their being chosen. They were informed straight from the source. For us, not likely we're going to be called from a burning bush, and the age of the prophets is over, so how do we know when we're called to lead? Well, let's listen to that still small voice. Now, I can tell you from experience that sometimes the voice has to get a little bit louder in order for you to maybe want to listen to it. When I was just first starting to hear the voice about going to seminary, it started off with, you ought to do this. And I go, you got the wrong guy. A month or so later, it was announced again about this partnership that had been formed with Golden Gate and Saddleback. And it was, you ought to do this. And I go, you're nuts, which could lead to a whole discussion about God's grace, not zapping me with some sort of a nice big giant bolt for calling him nuts. And a month or so later, the third voice came along, and this time it was not so still and small. It was, do it now. And it was like, okay. And I went and signed up the next day. Like delayed obedience. There's a whole message on that too about delayed obedience not being obedience. Anyway, so once you hear the still small voice, hopefully you listen to it before he has to raise his voice. You ask God in prayer. It doesn't hurt to just get a confirmation to make sure that it is him, the one talking to you. As you develop a closer and closer relationship, it's going to be more and more obvious. But sometimes when we're just getting started, and as we go back to looking at, a lot of times God's going to ask us to do things that don't make sense to us, in the normal, quote unquote, normal way of the world. It doesn't hurt to ask for confirmation. It can save you from a lot of problems. But then stop, be still, and listen for his answer. That's one of the hardest things I still have time doing, is just being still long enough to listen for the answer. I'll give him this whole list of things, of what's on my mind, and like, oh, I really want to know what you want me to do about this or that or the other. And then it's like, okay, in Jesus' name, amen, bye. And then don't stop and listen for the answer. And then once you are confirmed that that's definitely what he wants you to do, then do it. Do what he says. Do it in the way he says. Be willing to continuously learn as God defines his will. We've said it before that as long as you're a leader, you're going to be a learner. The minute you stop learning, you're going to stop being a leader. So continuously listen as he defines his will for your leadership role, because he's going to be guiding you, like we saw in that chart way back at the beginning of this session. That's one of the things he does. As he's guiding you through, he's going to keep you learning so he can make you ready for whatever he's going to deploy you into next. So listen to others around you. They just might see qualities that you don't even know you have. One example of this is, Pastor Rick Warren. Back when he was younger, he was working at a camp thinking he wanted to be a worship leader. And one of the camp counselors there came out and said, I think you'd really make a much better speaker than you would be a worship leader. And, just think what might have happened if he hadn't listened to what this other person had told him. That's a case where God was using somebody else to tell him, to point out the quality that he didn't even know he had. And God just, may use these other people to guide you into your leadership role. And as we mentioned, sometimes you need to listen. We were talking about the detractors. Sometimes you do need to listen to them just long enough to stop and say, okay, I know I don't need to worry so much about what they think, but is there any truth in what they're saying? And ask God, to say, hey, is there any truth in what they're saying about me? It might just be that, they are seeing something that, those that are comfortable with you in your leadership role aren't seeing. And it might be just a way of God nudging you a little bit and saying, yeah, we need to tweak this a little bit. And the detractor, they might have completely different motives behind them as why they're saying some of these things. And 99% of what they're saying might be complete bunk. But that 1% that is true might be a way that God's using just to get your attention, to make one of those little mid-course corrections to get you back on track as he's guiding you to wherever he's going to be using you for next. So that's it for looking at the leadership qualities of King David. So in the next lesson, we'll be online and we'll be looking at the leadership of Paul. So we'll see you then.